stones piled up beside a big ditch. Scattered rocks in the bottom of a river. Huge wooden timbers in the bottom of a creek. Stark abutments along the river's banks. A big ditch that winds for miles across Indiana along the rivers, beside railroads and highways, sometimes holding an inch or two of water, mostly dry. These are the ruins of Indiana's 19th century canal system. Once these were busy thoroughfares carrying the lifeblood of a young nation and shaping the future of Indiana. Now, more than 150 years old, silent and overgrown, they have become a part of our landscape. Just as the canals themselves have made enduring marks on the Indiana landscape, they have had deep and lasting effects on the social and economic structures of the state. This is their story. When the first French explorers reached Indiana around 1680, they followed the trails which had been used for centuries by the Native American peoples as they carried on their own trading, traveling, and exploring. The many rivers of Indiana form an intricate network of waterways that could be used for travel to almost any part of the state. The early explorers learned that there were certain places where parts of two rivers lay so close together that it was possible to carry the boats from one river to another, and thus proceed for many miles. The Frenchmen called such a place a portage, which means carrying place. Now, we usually say portage. One of the most useful portages connected the Maumee River, which flows eastward to Lake Erie, and the Little River, a tributary of the Wabash, which joins the Ohio. The divide between the Maumee and Wabash rivers is very low, carved by meltwater from the glaciers of 12,000 years ago. This Maumee-Wabash Trough, as it is called, was once the bed of a gigantic river that followed the routes of the present-day Wabash and Ohio rivers into the Great Mississippi Basin. With the Maumee flowing toward Lake Erie and the Little River flowing to the Wabash, a nearly level area remained between the two rivers where the water did not flow, but lay stagnant in a great marshy area known as the Portage Marsh. Along the north edge of this marsh ran a trail where the travelers carried and dragged their boats and their goods. This 7-mile portage was the only break in a continuous water route between the French settlements of Quebec and Montreal in Canada, and the important seaport of New Orleans in French Louisiana. The route through the interior of the continent was especially important to the French, who also hoped to establish a military presence in the interior regions, strengthening their hold on the land. As they slogged through the mud of the portage trail, many travelers must have had the idea that a ditch or canal could be dug through this soggy place. In the Ordinance of 1787, the United States reserved this portage for its citizens as a common highway to be used without any taxes, imposts, or duty, thus establishing its importance as a national roadway. President Washington recognized the importance of good transportation routes, and in a letter to Jacob Reed, dated November 3, 1784, he wrote, "Extend the inland navigation of the eastern waters, communicate them as near as possible by excellent roads, with those which run to the westward. Open these to the Ohio and such others as extend from Ohio towards Lake Erie, and we shall not only draw the produce of the western settlers, but the fur and peltry trades of the lakes also to our ports, to the amazing increase of our exports, while we bind these people to a chain which can never be broken." The evacuation by the British of their forts in the Northwest Territory by 1796 had permitted the young nation to secure its hold on the upper Ohio Valley, and the experiences of the United States in the War of 1812 showed the necessity of adequate transportation in military operations in the West. Captain McAfee, in 1816, writing in his History of the War of 1812, said,
"The Maumee is navigable from this place to the lake, and the portage to the nearest navigable branch of the Wabash is but 7 or 8 miles through a level, marshy prairie from which the water runs both to the Wabash and to the St. Mary's. A canal at some future day will unite these rivers."
The first real efforts at canal building in Indiana took place along the Ohio River at New Albany and Jeffersonville. Here, the Ohio River rushed over a submerged limestone ledge in 2 miles of rapids. Judge James Hall, who saw the rapids at close hand, wrote,
"The ear is stunned with the sound of rushing waters, and the sight of waves dashing and foaming and whirling among the rocks and eddies below is grand and fearful."
As settlement continued, the Ohio became an important river of commerce, carrying not only the canoes and pirogues of the Indians and early traders, but now the flatboats and keelboats of an increasing commerce. The thought of building a canal along the falls of the Ohio must also have occurred to many travelers. In 1805, the Indiana Canal Company was chartered to build a canal around the Ohio Falls. A series of unsuccessful efforts were made, but a canal around the falls was not completed until 1831, on the Kentucky side of the river. The idea of using canals to take boats around impassable sections of rivers, or as water highways, was not a new one. In 1681, the Canal du Midi was opened in France, connecting the Atlantic Ocean with the Mediterranean Sea. It brought new commerce and prosperity to the previously isolated interior regions which it crossed. In England, it was the demand for coal as fuel for the growing Industrial Revolution that inspired the beginnings of the canal era. In 1761, the Duke of Bridgewater's Canal was opened, connecting the Duke's coal mines at Worsley with the city of Manchester. There, the coal was sold in great quantities, at a much lower price to the public, and at much greater profits to the Duke. Other businessmen were quick to notice. By 1800, there were nearly 700 miles of artificial waterways in operation in Great Britain, as well as many more miles throughout Europe. In North America, the United States looked westward to a vast and fertile continent, a whole new world of land, waiting to be taken and used. To the east, across the Atlantic, were millions of overcrowded, land-hungry people. From all around, jealous rivals grasped at the western country. The dangers were great. The opportunities were stupendous. No one understood these things better than Albert Gallatin, Secretary of the Treasury under Thomas Jefferson. In 1808, in his famous Report on Roads and Canals, Gallatin wrote,
"The inconveniences, complaints, and perhaps dangers, which may result from a vast extent of territory, cannot otherwise be radically removed or prevented than by opening speedy and easy communication through all its parts. Good roads and canals will shorten distances, facilitate commercial and personal intercourse, and unite by a still more intimate community of interests the most remote quarters of the United States. No other single operation within the power of government can more effectually tend to strengthen and perpetuate that union which secures external independence, domestic peace, and internal liberty."
Gallatin contended that the greatest benefit would come from a unified system of transportation routes, rather than from unconnected routes. He also felt that the federal government alone was capable of such grand undertakings. Although the basic wisdom of Gallatin's program was generally recognized, there was much opposition to it, and it was never actually carried out. Many Americans distrusted a strong central government, and felt that internal improvements should be financed by the states through which they passed. It was also believed that the Constitution did not permit federally financed public works projects. The campaign for federally funded internal improvements was long and complex. Most popular of these proposals was the American system, advocated by Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and John Quincy Adams. This system called for a series of roads and canals connecting all parts of the country. The American system was never constructed, but the national road from the eastern seaboard to the western country, already underway, became a reality. The project that was to fire the imagination of the western states, touching off the canal era in America, was the Grand Canal of New York, better known as the Erie Canal. Opened in 1825, the Erie Canal of New York had proved successful beyond even the wildest hopes of its creators. The canal had brought great prosperity to the state of New York, sending New York City well on its way toward becoming the nation's primary seaport. Also, the Erie Canal offered great benefits to the regions bordering the Great Lakes, allowing easy transportation to the bustling markets of the eastern seaboard. In the 1820s, Pennsylvania had begun work on an extensive system of railroads and waterways, partly as a result of competition between the cities of Philadelphia and New York. In 1825, the state of Ohio had begun construction on its own internal improvement system, including 2 canals to connect the Ohio River with Lake Erie. Indiana congressmen lobbied long and hard for a canal to connect the Maumee and Wabash rivers, arguing that such a canal would not only benefit the trade of Indiana, but that it would greatly extend the markets of the eastern cities, especially New York. In 1827, they were rewarded by the passage of a bill which, for the first time anywhere, granted federal land to the state of Indiana for a canal. The land was to be sold, and the proceeds were to finance construction of a Wabash-Erie Canal. The land was to consist of alternate mile-square sections of land for 5 miles on each side of the route of the proposed waterway. This land was to be sold to finance the canal construction, while the remaining section stayed under federal control. The bill also stipulated that construction must begin within 5 years. On January 9, 1832, a board of fund commissioners was established. This board was given the power to borrow $200,000 for building a canal. The board selected Washington's birthday as the date of groundbreaking, and at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, on February 22nd, with only 9 days to spare on the 5-year deadline set in 1827, a small procession set out from John's Hotel in Fort Wayne. Headed by Jordan Vegas, the only canal commissioner present, they proceeded across the St. Mary's River to a spot on the feeder line where the ceremony was to take place. After a speech by Charles Ewing, a prominent local citizen, Jordan Vegas addressed the small crowd present. He concluded with the words, "I am now about to commence the Wabash and Erie Canal in the name and by the authority of the state of Indiana." He then dug a spadeful of earth, while the crowd gave 3 cheers. After some delay, work began in the Fort Wayne area in 1832. Soon, more than 1,000 laborers were moving dirt with pick and shovel, while more skilled artisans built locks, culverts, and aqueducts under the guidance of the hard-working chief engineer, Jesse L. Williams. At the close of 1832, 19 miles of the Wabash and Erie Canal were under construction. By 1834, crews were working on the Wabash and Erie Canal west of Fort Wayne. Captain Campbell of Park County later described how the dirt was moved in carts and wheelbarrows.
Each teamster led 2 horses, one at a time, from the shovel pit to the dump or towpath, where a dump boss directed to haw, tee, and back. That was the command whether the turn to be made was haw or gee. The boss would throw his weight on the back end of the cart bed, when it would tip down and shoot the dirt out backward and down the embankment. The driver, or leader more properly, would lead the horse and cart back to the shovel pit and turn and back the cart to the pit and lead the other horse and cart to the bank. While one horse was being led to the bank or towpath, 6 to 8 shovelers would be filling the other cart. I led 2 horses for Tom Burns, an Irishman and son-in-law of one McAndry, who had a mile of the work called a section.
In 1835, boats were running to Huntington, and the proposed canal had been extended to Lafayette. Indiana, in the mid-1830s, with most of its population clustered along the Ohio River, with the little mud street village of Indianapolis nearly isolated in an almost roadless interior, and with the northern half of the state almost uninhabited, watched longingly the projects of its neighbors to the east. There was some debate as to whether it would be better to build canals, which had been so successful in New York and other states, or to build railroads, which some people thought were superior. Railroad supporters, among them Governor James B. Ray, said that railroads would run faster and could run all year round, as well as being cheaper to build. Canal men argued that canals could be built with local materials such as earth, timber, and stone, while railroads were built with iron rails, which were expensive and had to be imported from England. In 1827, a committee of the Indiana Senate reported that every consideration of usefulness, practicability, durability, and economy point to canals and render it obviously inexpedient to waste time upon the subject of railways. When Governor Noah Noble addressed the Indiana legislature in December of 1834, he stated that no good reason can be assigned why we should longer hesitate to follow the successful examples of other states, to borrow money at a fair rate of interest, and expend it upon some well-selected objects of paramount public utility will not embarrass the government or impoverish the people, but on the contrary will enrich both. In the following legislative session, in January of 1836, Representative Robert Evans introduced an internal improvements bill that was to create a unified system of transportation routes covering the whole state. This mammoth bill, as it was called, created a 6-member board of internal improvements, which was to survey, superintend, and complete 8 projects for which money was to be borrowed by the state. Politically speaking, the Whitewater Valley was the most powerful region of the state, and, heading the list, was an appropriation of $1,400,000 for the construction of the Whitewater Canal, running from Lawrenceburg on the Ohio and up the West Fork of the Whitewater River to the crossing of the National Road at Cambridge City. Provisions were also made for a canal or railroad north from Cambridge City to connect with the Central Canal in Delaware or Madison County. Also included in the bill was the Central Canal, connecting with the Wabash and Erie near Peru and running through Anderson, Indianapolis, Martinsville, and on to Evansville on the Ohio River. An extension of the Wabash and Erie Canal from the mouth of the Tippecanoe River to Terre Haute, including the Crosscut Canal from Terre Haute to Point Commerce, where it would connect with the Central Canal. The Madison and Lafayette Railroad, which was to connect Madison, Columbus, Indianapolis, Crawfordsville, and Lafayette. The New Albany and Vincennes Turnpike, a road or railroad from Jeffersonville to Crawfordsville. Improvements to the Wabash River between the Ohio River and Vincennes, in cooperation with the state of Illinois. And finally, a survey was to be made for a canal or railroad between the Wabash and Erie Canal near Fort Wayne to Goshen, South Bend, LaPorte, and Michigan City. Construction was to begin within 10 years. The routes were laid out through the maximum number of counties and communities so that everybody, or nearly everybody, got something. In order to finance this huge undertaking, the commissioners were empowered to borrow $10 million at 5% for 25 years and to pledge as security all canal, railroad, and turnpike property, rents, tolls, and profits. Newspapers talked about
the dawning of a new era in our legislation, highly creditable to the character of Indiana. These days must be portentous of great results, which ere long will place Indiana among the brightest stars in the firmament of our widely extended and happy republic.
It was fervently believed by the legislators as well as their constituents that the internal improvement system would not cost the public 1 cent, while the tolls and other revenues would pay for the system itself in a few years, and would also pay for the expenses of the state government, making taxes unnecessary. It was hard to be against such a wonderful plan. While celebrations went on in Indiana, 3 fund commissioners were in New York to borrow the $10 million. After 2 months of frustration, 2 of the commissioners, Samuel Hanna and Jeremiah Sullivan, left New York empty-handed and turned over the power to contract loans to Dr. Isaac Coe. Dr. Coe negotiated a loan of $1,029,000 with Thomas Biddle and Company of Philadelphia and the Morris Canal and Banking Company of New Jersey, and one of $500,000 with the firm of J.J. Cohens and Brothers. Unfortunately, the Morris Canal Company was in bad shape financially, and the J.J. Cohens firm would collapse within the year. Coe started selling the bonds on credit, which was a risky business and illegal as well. He also became a stockholder in the Morris Canal Company and worked out a deal in which the Morris Company bought bonds from him at 88 and would sell them at 96, splitting the profits with Dr. Coe. It was a time when banking laws were much less strict than they are today, and there was a devil-may-care attitude associated with high finance in general. Our current ideas about business ethics had not yet been formed, and Dr. Coe's business methods were far from unique. It would be several years, however, before Coe's wheeling and dealing was found out, and back in Indiana he was hailed as an honest and conscientious public servant. Padding of contracts and many other irregular practices were to plague the management of the whole internal improvements project throughout its life. Pressure from the Whitewater Valley farmers and businessmen was sufficient to have work on its canal commenced in 1837. By June 1839, boats were running from Lawrenceburg to Brookville. In this same year, the state of Indiana faced bankruptcy as a result of the economic conditions of the country and, to an even greater extent, as a result of mismanaged efforts to carry out the Internal Improvements Act. With only small portions of the work done, building on all of the state projects was totally suspended. The 30-mile stretch of the Whitewater Canal between Brookville and Lawrenceburg was completed and was operated by the state between 1839 and 1841. The legislature of 1841-42 was persuaded to grant a charter to the Whitewater Canal Company to complete the canal from Brookville to the National Road at Cambridge City. The state transferred its interests in the canal to the newly chartered company on condition that it would be completed in 5 years. When the necessary funds were available, the directors met at Connersville July 25, 1842, and broke ground for the canal 3 days later. The year of 1843 was occupied in constructing the company's lavish and beautiful headquarters building in Connersville. Actual work on the canal got going in 1844, and the ditch moved north at a fairly rapid pace. The Native was the first boat to reach Connersville June 1845. By October of that year, the Belle of Indiana reached Cambridge City. When the Hagerstown Canal Company, financed by local credit and aided by volunteer labor, extended the channel to Hagerstown, 8 miles north of the National Road, a through line of 36 miles ran to Lawrenceburg. A 25-mile canal from Cincinnati connected with the Whitewater Canal at Harrison, making Cincinnati a choice terminus for shippers along the canal route. From Huntington, the Wabash and Erie had crept to beyond Logansport, but Ohio had not yet built the eastern section, and without eastern terminals, the canal could not pay revenue. The Tippecanoe River was reached in 1841. In 1842, the Ohio portion of the canal was finished. Navigation was open to the lake, and the legislature authorized its extension to Terre Haute. Two problems were inseparably connected for the state of Indiana in 1845. One was to complete the Wabash and Erie Canal to a point where it would become profitable. The other was to provide a way to manage the state debt. Charles Butler, a New York attorney and agent of the canal bondholders, proposed a compromise to resolve the issues. Laboring for over a year, the legislature finally approved the Butler Bill on January 27, 1847. One of the more popular features of the bill was a clause providing for the completion of the Wabash and Erie from the lakes to the Ohio River. The work of extension proceeded slowly. The canal was opened to Terre Haute in 1849 and was completed to Evansville in the spring of 1853. It extended a distance of 450 miles, the longest man-made waterway in America. Although we sometimes think of the Indiana canals simply as big ditches, they actually were complex works of engineering. Digging a ditch to carry off excess water is one thing. Building a canal that can carry commercial boat traffic is another. The Indiana canals were built about 40 feet wide at the waterline and 26 feet wide at the bottom. The water was 4 feet deep. These were the minimum specifications, and the waterways were often built larger when it was convenient. Feeder dams were built to supply water to the canal from the major rivers and creeks, and there were waste gates built in the towpath of the canal to let out excess water. Because they had to be kept level, the canals could not be built in straight lines like roads and railroads, but they had to follow the contours of the land, curving around hills and valleys, keeping always to the same elevation. Many short canals were built this way without locks, but eventually on the longer route, the changes in elevation became too great, and something had to be done. The solution was the pound lock, or lift lock. This consisted of a chamber, built from stone or timber, and big enough to hold a canal boat. In Indiana, these were about 90 feet long and 15 feet wide. At both ends of the lock were watertight gates that would shut off the connection with the upper or lower level. These lock gates were made of wood, with huge balance beams that served as levers for opening or closing the gates. For a boat to ascend the lock, the upper gates had to be closed and the water let out of the chamber until it was even with the lower level. Then the lower gates were opened, and the boat pulled into the lock. The lower gates were closed, and the wicket gates were opened in the upper lock gates to let water into the chamber. As the water rose to the same height as the upper level, the boat floated on the water, so when the chamber was completely full, the upper gates could be opened, and the boat pulled out of the chamber and on through the canal. Sometimes the canal would have to cross a stream or creek, and this was done by building a culvert under the canal to carry the water of the stream. Culverts were sometimes made of cut stone as an arch, such as this one at Prairie Creek near Peru. On smaller streams, a wooden box culvert was used, built so that it was submerged in the water of the stream to keep the wood from rotting. These pictures show how the wooden culverts were built. When the canal had to cross a large creek or a river, a bridge was built to carry the canal water in a wooden trough. This was called an aqueduct, and the Duck Creek Aqueduct on the Whitewater Canal at Metamora is a good example of the covered bridge type of aqueduct. Another type of aqueduct that was used on Indiana canals was the open trunk type, which had no roof. Here, we see a painting of the large Eel River Aqueduct at Logansport on the Wabash Erie Canal. The boats were pulled along by horses or mules, who walked along a tow path that ran along one side of the canal. When the canal passed over an aqueduct, a platform was built out over the water from one end of the aqueduct to the other, so the animals could pull the boat through. The animals were hitched to a tow line, a heavy rope about 90 or 100 feet long, which was made fast to the boat. Sometimes a river would be dammed up to raise the level and slow down the current, and the boats would be locked into the river and pulled across by the animals walking on a bridge. Here we see the wooden outlet lock to the Maumee River at Defiance, Ohio, with the towpath bridge in the background. This is similar to the arrangements near Delphi on the Wabash and on the White River near Newberry. Canal boats in Indiana were privately owned, and nearly any type of boat could and did use the canals. Sometimes a farmer would take goods to town in a canoe or a rowboat, and timber was made up into big rafts that floated down the canals to the sawmills. The larger the boat, the more goods it could carry, and the more money could be made on each trip. There was a real economic advantage to using large boats. However, the boat could not be any larger than the locks it had to pass through, so the largest boats were about 90 feet long and 14 feet wide. Commercial boats came in 3 primary types. Most glamorous were the packets, or passenger boats. These were fitted up with a large cabin that took up most of the space on board. There was a small platform at the rear of the boat for the steersman, and another at the front. Passengers could sit or stand on the roof of the cabin when the weather was good, but they had to be on the lookout for low bridges. The packets usually traveled non-stop on long trips, and the horses were changed with fresh teams at intervals. It took about 60 hours for a packet boat to travel on the Wabash Erie Canal from Lafayette to Toledo. In a letter written in 1851, a young lady of Louisville, Kentucky described a trip with her brother through Indiana on a Wabash Erie packet boat.
We went on board by way of a board, a gangplank that is, and soon found ourselves in a dark hole-like room, where it was hard to breathe and impossible to see plainly. There was a queer smell. Tom says all canal boats have that odor. Of course, this being my first experience, I cannot say how true that is. We presently went up a steep little stairway and came out upon the top of the boat, which was already in motion, very slow motion though, and the dingy houses began to slide so it looked back to the rear. A single horse pulls our vessel, and the loutish boy who manages him has hair as white as tow. Sometimes the horse pokes along, sometimes the boy makes it trot for a short distance. I'm sitting on a stool on top of the boat, writing with my paper on my knee. The mosquitoes bother me some, but they are not very thick. The first lock that we went through caused me to have a very queer feeling. Our boat entered a place where the sides of the canal were walled up with logs and plank and stopped before a gate. At the same time, a gate was closed astern of us, and then the boat began to rise up as the front of the gate was slowly opened. By this means, we were lifted to a higher level, upon which we proceeded. But when the boat began to rise, I felt as though something dreadful was about to happen. We have passed through some lovely country where rich farms like those in some parts of Tennessee stretch away as far as you can look. On our left, a short distance away, the Wabash River has been in sight most of the time, and beyond it, large fields of bottom land waving with luxuriant young corn. On our right, the farms are more rolling in places, but fertile and well kept. To get to the dining room, I have to climb up a ladder through a hole in the top of the boat, and then go down through another hole into a suffocating box. The table is horrid, so is the cooking. Pork and bread and pork, and then some greasy fish, mackerel, and bitter coffee, lukewarm, 3 times each day. I am raving hungry all the time, and nothing fit to eat. It makes me violently angry to see Tom gorge like a pig and pretend that stewed beans and catfish are delicious. The little towns along by the canal are forlorn-looking places, but they seem to be doing business. Tom says that some of the men are getting rich. I do not see the evidence of it if they are. For hours today, we sneaked along the prairie. I think that sneaked exactly expresses it, for the boat acted as though it wanted to creep up to something and take it unaware. The public roads in many places run along close to the towpath of the canal, and I see people in wagons. They go faster than we do. I am outrageously tired, but Tom is delighted. It seems to suit him exactly.
Another type of canal craft was the line boat. These would carry both freight and passengers, although the passenger accommodations were not as comfortable as those on the packets. Line boats often carried their own spare teams in a stable on board. Freight boats also traveled on the canals, carrying only freight, but often with a small cabin for the crew who lived on board. Many of the canal boats were owned by large companies, which operated whole fleets of boats, but many others were owned by the people who ran them. Sometimes whole families lived on the boats, with the children helping to drive the animals on the towpath. Canaling may seem romantic to us today, but to those kids who spent their whole childhood following the mules on the towpath, it was probably not much fun. The period from 1847 to 1856 may be regarded as the heyday of Indiana's canals. Until 1853, there was a steady increase in income from tolls and water rents, and a decreasing annual average cost of repairs and maintenance. In 1852, tolls and rents reached their highest amount, $193,400. With a waiting market in the East and an economical means of transportation, Indiana farm products became valuable export commodities. Wagon loads of grain, flour, pork products, hay, beans, butter, hides, feathers, wool, tobacco, and whiskey were loaded onto eastbound canal boats to be traded for eastern manufactured products. Hardware, farm tools, salt, sugar, sewing machines, pianos, dried fish, cloth, furniture, and other manufactured goods flowed into Indiana. Towns along the canals became important trade centers. Large storehouses were built to store the produce that was hauled to the canals. Long trains of wagons waited by the hour at these rising commercial centers for their turn to unload the products of the farm and countryside. At Lafayette, 400 wagons unloading during a single day was not unusual. Promising canal towns such as LaGros, Attica, Americus, Lockport, Pittsburgh, and Metamora sprang into existence during the canal's heyday, but lapsed into relative obscurity with the passing of the canal era. With the constant flow of European settlers, other newcomers flocked to Indiana from the old northeastern states, New York, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. Settlers also arrived from southern Indiana, southern Ohio, Kentucky, Virginia, and the Carolinas. By 1850, the population would grow to 988,000, a threefold increase from 350,000 in 1832. Available water power encouraged many varied industries. Every town along the canal had its warehouses, grain elevators, pork packing houses, hotels, and mercantile establishments. Manufacturers produced everything from barrels and barrel staves to iron stoves, furniture, and pottery. Strong ties were being forged with the eastern states as a result of the canal's stimulating business and encouraging immigration. It was a significant step in turning the business interests of Indiana toward the eastern seaboard. With a population hailing largely from the northeast, and with markets in that direction, both business and political interests became closely knit with those of the north and east. Although the canals had ushered in a new and prosperous time for many parts of Indiana, their days were numbered, almost from the start. Back in the 1830s, when the internal improvement system was being planned, it was argued that the technology of canals had been well proved by many years of use, both in Europe and America, while railroads were newfangled, unreliable, and had to be built with iron rails imported from England. By the 1840s, iron rails were being made in the United States, resulting in reduced construction costs. By the 1850s, after almost 40 years of development, the steam locomotive was a powerful and reliable machine. The canals, on the other hand, did not turn out to be nearly as reliable as had been hoped. When the Wabash-Erie Canal was built, it was intended that all of the structures, such as locks and culverts, would be made of cut stone in a permanent fashion, as had been the accepted practice on earlier waterways. Unfortunately, the engineers could not find any good building stone in the upper Wabash Valley, so the locks and other structures were built of timber. The estimated life of a timber lock was only about 15 years, but timber was cheap and plentiful, and there were also plenty of woodworkers. The plan was to rebuild them with cut stone shipped in on the canal itself after good quarries were found. An excellent quarry was found at Georgetown near Logansport, but the canal was not opened to Georgetown until 1839, when the state was already in serious financial trouble. South of Lafayette, there were other problems. The canal was opened to Evansville in 1853. 3 years later, on May 28, 1856, the editor of the Evansville Inquirer wrote,
"The break in the canal which occurred at Feazell's Ferry a few weeks since, and which had been repaired, has again given way. No prospect for a resumption of navigation within 2 weeks. This accident will increase the distress along the canal, as much pork, lard, bacon, etc., had been unloaded from flat boats on the White River and Patoka and hauled to the canal."
On August 16th, the editor of the Evansville Journal wrote, "The breaks are all mended, but navigation cannot yet be resumed on account of the scarcity of water. The quantity in the canal is insufficient for navigation purposes, and the water in White River being lower than the bottom of the canal, none can be supplied until a rise occurs. There are over a dozen boats aground at different points that cannot be moved until more water can be supplied." On the 28th of August, the Inquirer reported,
"The canal boat Flying Cloud arrived Monday night and reports only 8 inches of water in the summit. Until the canal rises, no loaded boats can pass. She was hauled through by 3 teams."
3 months later, in November, the Inquirer complained,
"The canal has broken again, as usual. If the trustees do not put a new superintendent on the division about Petersburg, the work might as well be abandoned at once. The man Wright, who now has charge, does not care one fig whether there is one drop of water in the canal below his mill or not, so that way he can make money out of it.
1857 was no better. At Kossuth in Clay County, somebody hacked off the balance beams of the lock several times and cut the canal bank, draining out the water. In 1858, the Wabash flooded, causing extensive damage. Vandalism was also a serious problem. In 1860, after several attempts, the Birch Creek Reservoir, a major water supply, was cut and drained by local residents. This effectively ended navigation in the crosscut. It was correctly believed that the high incidence of miasma, or malaria, in the region had something to do with the proximity of the many acres of shallow, stagnant water in the reservoirs. While state-employed doctors reported that the reservoirs were healthy, the farmers were busy with their spades, blasting powder, and dynamite. Each year, the state engineers filed reports assuring that the canal could be put back into full operation at the cost of only a few $1,000s. Meanwhile, banks washed out and lock gates rotted. Railroads were being built to many of the cities along the canal, and as they gradually took over more and more of the shipping, the Wabash Erie was abandoned, piece by piece. In 1860, 16 years after the first canal boats reached Terre Haute, the canal ended there. By 1868, navigation stopped at Armiesburg in Park County. Yet, with incredible vitality, the Wabash Erie remained open through the 1860s. In 1871, the St. Mary's Aqueduct at Fort Wayne was completely rebuilt, and other repairs were made. But it was too late. In 1872, the Rocky Mountain left the village of Lodi in Park County, bound for Toledo. She was the last boat to make it that far. A historical marker at Fort Wayne notes that the last canal boat seen in that area was in 1882. In Pittsburgh, where the Wabash Dam had created a water-powered industrial center, another marker states that the dam was blown up in 1881, and that ended it. The slow death of the Wabash Erie is contrasted with the fate of the Whitewater Canal. You will recall that the canal was started with state funds under the Internal Improvements Act in 1837 and finished with private capital in 1845. Work started on the Cincinnati and Whitewater Canal in 1838. Lawrenceburg hated it. Whitewater Valley loved it. Cincinnati loved it. The Cincinnati and Whitewater Canal was opened in 1841 and immediately took most of the trade of the valley to Cincinnati. In 1848, the 12-mile portion of the canal between Harrison and Lawrenceburg was closed. The rest of the Whitewater Canal suffered from frequent and disastrous floods that repeatedly wrecked the canal and kept it out of operation for months at a time. Finally, in 1865, the canal was sold to the Indianapolis and Cincinnati Railroad Company, and in 1867 tracks were laid on the towpath between Harrison and Cambridge City. Because of the extremely low bridges built by the railroad company, the canal could no longer be used for transportation. The old ditch could still carry water, though, and many water-powered mills along the canals continued to operate. Hydraulic power from the old Whitewater Canal had made Connorsville a thriving industrial center, and the Whitewater Dam and feeder canal there were kept in repair until the 1950s. At Metamora, the old aqueduct was used to carry water from the Laurel Feeder Dam over Duck Creek to power the mills at Millville and Brookville. The mill owners kept it in repair until the 1940s, long enough for it to be rescued by the state of Indiana after the urging of local historians, with the creation of the Whitewater Canal State Memorial in 1946. Today, in Metamora on the Whitewater Canal, visitors can relive the days of the canal era. The Whitewater Canal State Historical Site is a reminder of Indiana's early transportation and industrial development. The center of activities is in the restored canal town. Here are located the historic brick grist mill at Lock 25, the covered Duck Creek Aqueduct, and the Millville Lock number 24. Visitors may ride the horse-drawn Ben Franklin on a half-hour journey back into time as the boat moves slowly down the canal, through the Duck Creek Aqueduct to the Millville Lock and return. More than 8 stone locks may still be found along the canal route. They serve as reminders of the excellent workmanship of the stonemasons that shaped the native limestone with hammer and chisel. The mill in Metamora was one of several built in the area. Water was diverted from the canal to turn tub water wheels. By the 1860s, the canal was no longer used for transportation, and the mill owners installed a new, more powerful turbine water wheel in the canal lock. The mill burned in the late 19th century and was rebuilt in 1900. Back on June 18, 1839, the first boat, the Ben Franklin, arrived at Brookville from Lawrenceburg. It was a gala occasion, and was accompanied by the usual program of speeches, festivities, toasts, and jovial atmosphere. On June 18th and 19th, 1985, a reenactment of this historical event was presented at Metamora. The Ben Franklin was again the name of the boat. A large crowd greeted the vessel as she slowed to the dock. Cheers, a brass band, cannon fire, and waving flags were the order of the day. Political speeches were given from the top deck of the Ben Franklin as the crowd shouted its approval, or disapproval, of the speaker's remarks. Present-day canalers can dream. In Delphi, Indiana, the dream is becoming a reality. The Carroll County Wabash and Erie Canal Association has labored to awaken interest in the preservation of a mile-long, watered section of the old canal. A canal park along the north bank is slowly taking form. Improvements include an open shelter house constructed from the timbers of the old Spice warehouse that stood along the canal route, the Coons Log House that has been moved to the park, and the Reed Case home. This federal-style building was built by Mr. Case, who was superintendent of construction for the canal in Delphi. The Case House now rests proudly on its cement foundation overlooking the canal. When completely restored, it will serve as the focal point for varied historical, recreational, and festival events. Most of the events we have been talking about happened more than 100 years ago. As patterns of economic growth have changed, the canals were first made obsolete by the railroads, and then were utilized by the railroads. In Pike, Davies, and Greene counties, 48 miles of Conrail track run on the canal banks. In Allen County, about 6 miles of the Norfolk Southern lies in the canal bed. On the Whitewater, nearly the whole canal towpath has been used as railroad grade. Many miles of the canals are used as road beds for major highways such as US 24, as well as many county roads. At Lockport in Carroll County, the big stone arch culvert over Burnett Creek now serves as a county road bridge, still solid after 150 years. In the early days of the 20th century, interurban electric rail lines were built along the old towpaths, but these too have been abandoned. The electric companies still retain easements in many places, so electric power lines often follow the canal routes. The canals are also used as drainage ditches in many areas. If we add up all of these uses, we find that over 142 miles of the old Wabash and Erie Canal is still being used for something, even today. The portion of the Central Canal between Broad Ripple and downtown Indianapolis has been maintained over the years to carry water to the city. This section of the Central Canal has been in continuous use since 1839, and it now supplies water for the new canal through White River Park. The canal lines are punctuated with picturesque stone ruins. The proud abutments of the old aqueducts still stand on the banks of the Eel River at Logansport, at the St. Mary's in Fort Wayne, at the White River Crossing north of Petersburg, and at Shawnee Creek in Fountain County, to name just a few. At Aboit Creek in Allen County, only a few stones remain on the old foundation timbers, but with careful measurements, members of the Canal Society of Indiana prepared these reconstructed views of the aqueduct that once stood there. Along the Whitewater Canal, many of the old stone lock chambers have survived to delight the eyes and fire the imaginations of canal explorers. On the Wabash Erie, a few stone locks remain, such as this one, lock number 14, now sitting in its own little park at LeGros. Also near LeGros are two more stone locks, numbers 13 and 12, while Lock 47 stands in solitude near Riley in Vigo County. Most of the Wabash Erie locks were built of timber, and these have left very few traces on the surface. Sometimes the flooring timbers have been exposed by running water, such as this one in Clay County, but most of them are completely silted up. It takes a careful eye, but we can see here the sudden narrowing of the old canal ditch and the abrupt drop in the level that betrays the old timber-built Lock number 2 in eastern Allen County. Near the little town of Americus in Tippecanoe County, the vacant windows of the old Americus Inn look out on a silent towpath. The influences of the canals on the areas they served have been many and profound. Whole cities in the northern part of Indiana owe their very existence to the canals, and many other communities would never have risen to prominence without them. During the canal era between 1842 and 1860, virtually all of the immigrants to Indiana traveled on the canals, to lands that were made profitable by those same canals. Water power from the canals spurred the industrial growth of the towns along the waterways, and cheap transportation coupled with the willing labor of hard-working immigrants completes the combination that led to the establishment of Indiana as a major industrial state. In the 1850s and 1860s, when the railroads were built through Indiana, they passed through communities that had been established because of the canals, communities that had thrived and grown because of the canals. Abandoned now, and mostly ignored, the canals themselves remain as monuments to the people who built and used them. These vast ruins still can speak to us of days gone by. Touching the old stones, walking the old towpaths, we hear voices and sounds, filtering through the years from long ago.